I think it's very heartening that the Minister, who unfortunately appears to have just left the room, underlined the government's commitment to the reforms and seems to appreciate the urgency of some of the reforms that we've been advocating for years. And of course, as he said, it's a pity to waste a good crisis. But what we're hoping with proposing what we propose in this research and the work that we do is to move beyond a crisis-led approach to reform, to get to a system where we build our public institutions with the necessary safeguards and checks and balances, that we're no longer just chasing crises, that we're actually proactively planning. And corruption prevention is a key part of that. Now, I'm going to run through the findings of the research. So the report, with its not so headline-grabbing title, National Integrity Systems Country Study Addendum. What is a national integrity system and what is a national integrity system study? So it's a cross-disciplinary analysis of the key governance institutions in the state. It's an attempt to it's like an integrity health check, a holistic analysis of safeguards within the state against poor governance and abuse of power. The concept and the methodology has been evolving since the 1980s by Transparency International, and thus far about 120 of these national integrity systems have been conducted throughout the world. And this research is accompanied by 20 other national integrity systems studies carried out in other European states, and it's all funded by the European Commission. And I'll give you talk to you some details about the general findings as I go on. So the integrity system it's about horizontal accountability, where each player in the state is both a watcher and is watched. And we devised, unfortunately, what is a Greek temple. It's probably the only kind of temple that was available, to illustrate what we view as the nation's integrity. So you have state's institutions serving as the pillars which maintain the roof, which is the nation's integrity, and it's buttressed by public support and society's values. So if you find a public that is apathetic or not watchful, the integrity system will not be so strong. The balls on the top of this temple represent the outcomes of a system that has integrity, sustainable development, rule of law and quality of life. Because as we've seen repeatedly in our own history, corruption is a very corrosive phenomenon, and it undermines the rule of law and democracy, and as we know now, with quality of life. This is how Transparency International defines corruption: abuse of entrusted power for private gain. But in the study we talk about 3 typologies of corruption, and I'd like to just run through those briefly. Petty corruption, in the form of bribes to low-level officials, is something that Ireland doesn't suffer from. In the most recent survey by Transparency International, the Global Corruption Barometer, only 4% of Irish respondents said that they had paid a bribe in the previous year. So that puts Ireland in the tier of countries least affected by petty corruption, such as bribery of low-level public officials. Now, when it comes to grand corruption, successive tribunal reports in Ireland have shown that we have had almost systemic levels of grand corruption in politics, in business and government. And we define grand corruption as acts committed at the high level of government that distort policy making and the central function of the state. And then finally, a term that we use in the study, and it's an evolving concept. This is a concept that John touched upon, of legal corruption. Recent research has shown that Ireland is perceived as having quite high levels of legal corruption, which takes many forms. It includes cronyism, patronage, and what's known as state capture, when powerful interest groups take hold of state policy and turn it away from the public good or the common interest to serve their own interests. People often perceive that it's only traditional forms of corruption that actually have an impact on economic development. But increasingly, I think the world is starting to realise that these legal forms of corruption can also lead to severe fiscal problems in developed countries. So turning to today's report, it's a stock take of progress from the 2009 study, which was our sort of baseline or scoping exercise on Ireland's integrity system. A lot has happened since then. We've had the final reports of the Mahon and Moriarty tribunals. Ireland has lost its economic sovereignty. A new administration has taken power with a programme for government pledging many radical reform in many areas. The 2009 study made several key findings. It concluded that despite the fact that Ireland has quite a centralised governance, that its national integrity system is strong by international standards. However, these are the key weaknesses that were identified in the 2009 study. And the chickens have come home to roost because many of the gaps that we identified in 2009 are gaps which led to the banking crisis, including the light touch, principles-based approach to financial regulation, including the lack of transparency in political funding and lobbying, including insufficient controls to ensure that sectoral interests do not have undue influence over policy making. And as we mentioned then, the crisis-led approach to fighting corruption is one that we're keen to turn away from, and to have an approach to fighting corruption that emphasises prevention. So the 2009 study made 39 recommendations. These are the key ones. We've been speaking about them this morning. In our review of that analysis as part of this addendum, we identified progress in 20 of the 39 recommendations. Not full progress in any, unfortunately, but partial progress. And we defined that as reforms that are based on programme for government pledges, bills, laws, and other proposals. So the progress that we can report since 2009, Ireland has ratified the United Nations Convention Against Corruption. And that's a really important blueprint for both future efforts by the state to fight corruption, but also it gives a framework to allow civil society to play a part in promoting and monitoring the convention. And we're very keen that Transparency International plays a significant role in that. White-collar crime measures have been introduced since 2009. Many were introduced to help with law enforcement officials as they try to investigate the fallout from the Anglo-Irish bank debacle. So we had new powers given to the Office of the Director of Corporate Enforcement and the Garda Bureau of Fraud Investigation to try and oblige reluctant witnesses to cooperate with the investigations. There's been some reform of party political funding this year, which will see parties obliged to publish annually audited accounts for the first time. That's a long overdue measure, and it's one that we welcome. We hope it will introduce more transparency for citizens, knowing how political parties, where they get their money from, and how they spend it. But we feel that there are other reforms necessary in that field. Now finally, we see the discredited light touch approach to regulation of the banks has been replaced with what's called a risk-based approach. The central bank has been reformed, the financial regulator is now part of the central bank, and they've been given many more enforcement powers. But as the Moriarty Tribunal remarked in its final report last year, there's a real need to develop a culture in which forthright regulation is actually valued, and that remains an ongoing challenge. So turning to the recommendations in this report. The recommendations that we make in this report are supplementary to the recommendations that we made in 2009. I just want to highlight a few of them for you. I think there's in total 13. Local government is still a corruption black spot, and we are calling for stronger measures, stronger safeguards at local level, including transparency measures, more emphasis on prevention through training and education and research at local government level. And local authorities are obliged to publish fraud and corruption alert and contingency plans. We would like these to become meaningful plans that are subject to open scrutiny and review on a yearly basis, and we would like to see them published online. We have a right to know what efforts local authorities are making to reform themselves. The Mahon Tribunal made many recommendations in this regard, and we would support those, including giving the Standards Public Office Commission an oversight role when it comes to enforcement of conflict of interest measures at local government level. We're also advocating that the government considers measures to encourage self-reporting of corruption and white-collar offences. These could include deferred prosecution agreements, corruption immunity programmes, and other measures that would help get past the fact that corruption is clearly a conspiratorial crime, and therefore we need measures to try and break open the black box that is corruption. We would like to see an increase in awareness raising and education, and we mean that in both a sort of formal educational sense and a general public awareness sense. As the Minister mentioned, levels of trust in political parties in the state have plummeted. We need to rebuild that, and in order to do that, we need more accountability and transparency in public life. People need to know what is right and what's wrong in order to report it. Now, finally, disclosures of interest for public officials aimed at preventing conflicts of interest. We think these are not wide enough and comprehensive enough, and the Mahon Tribunal has made many recommendations in this area, which we would also endorse. Now, as I mentioned, or as has been mentioned, this research is funded by the European Commission, and there are 24 other European countries that have produced NIS studies, and that's been a really valuable exercise for us. It has allowed us to identify common strengths and weaknesses in the 25 countries that are in this cluster of research. The regional report, which highlighted some of the issues emerging from the 25 country studies, is available at the back of the room. So how do EU countries stack up? Generally, the watchdog institutions perform best. And by that we mean audit institutions, ombudsmen, electoral management bodies. Judicial systems are strong. And like in Ireland and many other countries, there's a much bleaker picture of governments, law enforcement, civil society, political parties in particular. Now, the few eyebrows will be raised over the report's findings that Europe's integrity leaders tend to be countries like Denmark, Norway, Sweden. They all share very well entrenched transparency and accountability mechanisms, including very active and well-resourced and respected watchdog institutions. For example, in Sweden, freedom of information laws date back to 1766, and its ombudsman has existed since 1809. And it is also no surprise to find that Greece, Italy, and Portugal and Spain emerged as weak in terms of their integrity systems in the European research. They've all been found to have serious deficits in their anti-corruption frameworks, and you can read about that in the newspapers on a daily basis. So just finally, before I turn over to the first panel discussion, I just want to end with some of the findings from the final reports of the Mahon Tribunal and the 2006 report of Moriarty. Mahon found that corruption was endemic and systemic in Irish political life in the decade up to the mid-1990s, and that those involved in it operated with a sense of impunity and invincibility. Moriarty, for his part, spoke about this dismal period in the interface between politics and business. The Mahon report describes political corruption as a deeply corrosive and destructive force, and it's often compared to a disease like cancer. Now, it may be a slightly overused metaphor, but it's apt. It's apt because of the corrosive nature of it, but it's also apt because corruption mutates, metastasizes. It finds new pathways to exploit, new opportunities and new incentives. So a question that I have for the panelists in the discussions to follow is, what corruption risks are we looking at in 2012? Has it mutated? Has it changed? And what can we do to stop it at this stage? What new safeguards do we need? And I'll leave that open for the experts to ponder on as the debate starts. So thanks for listening. We have 5 minutes for questions if you'd like to ask John, myself, any questions on the report itself. And then after that, I'm going to introduce Sam Smith, and he'll introduce the panelists, and we'll kick off with the first panel session. So who's the first question? Sam has a question.
The idea of people self-reporting themselves for corruption, is that realistic?
That's related to companies that might self-report.
Yeah.
The law here has recently been changed, and it obliges anyone who knows of white collar crime to report it. So if you have a situation, for example, where a whistleblower within a company goes to his boss and says, there's this irregular practice going on, the company then is obliged in law to report that, and so they're incriminating themselves. So deferred prosecution agreement is a mechanism that's used in the United States, and it's also going to be introduced in the UK, where the company can fess up, go to the law enforcement authorities, and say, we believe there's wrongdoing in our business, and the prosecutor will defer charges while they investigate it. So that's one, yeah.
So I was going to point out as well that the Competition Authority already runs a cartel immunity programme.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And that programme was laid down under EU directives around competition and markets abuse, and that encourages people to come forward if they have information, even if they're part of a cartel, and be afforded some degree of immunity by the DPP if they fully cooperate with an investigation. So there is a precedent here as well.